As a kid, to make sense of how the world works, I sometimes imagined a group of invisible people who ran everything. They turned red lights green, dissolved traffic jams, made sure there's running tap water. Once I got older, I realized there was no global cabal running the world. But there are management consultants. A lot of them. They design hospitals and prisons, advise governments on the climate crisis, and map out cities. They even help build up entire economies. But they aren't elected politicians. To most people, they remain in the shadows, but they work for many of the world's most powerful governments, and some say they are gaining more and more influence. So let's explore this hidden world and look at how consultants have captured the government sector and what it means for societies around the world. That's coming up on Business Beyond. Consultancies have become a big deal over the past decades. You might already know some of them. Estimates say the consulting industry expanded from $100 billion to $1 trillion in the past 2 decades. But what even are consultants? Garrison Lovely used to be one.
It was the most depressed I remember being in my adult life.
More on that later. The term consultant is broad. It essentially just means someone who's hired to give professional advice, like how to improve a company's profits. Consultancies themselves promise nothing less than to make the world a better place.
So you want to advance the world. Give it a push. Move it in the right direction.
There are many different types of consultancies, but in this explainer, we will look at management consultancies: McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group BCG, and Bain & Company. The first two we will be focusing on. They are the most prestigious firms in the industry.
The firms that do management consulting pitch themselves to young college students at top schools as like the place to go to solve hard problems and work with the smartest people. I think they also pitch themselves as like more altruistic and more publicly interested than, Goldman Sachs or Bridgewater or, some other elite financial institution.
And among their biggest customers are governments. Rosie Collington wrote a book about this exact phenomenon.
We know that spending on consulting companies pretty much everywhere by governments has steadily increased over the past few decades.
Management consultants have been hired to solve an economic crisis in Costa Rica, design the smart city in Kenya, or roll out COVID vaccines in France. An impressive track record, but some experts are warning that the consulting industry isn't all it promises to be.
The consulting industry has expanded not necessarily because it is able to create value for economies and societies, for organizations, but actually because it invests in the ability to create the illusion of value, to create the perception that it is creating value.
Before we dive deeper, let's take a quick look at how we even got here. Late 1800s, the Second Industrial Revolution. Companies like General Electric start to employ engineers on a short-term basis. The contracting model spreads. So-called consultants start optimizing manufacturing processes across the US and Europe. By the mid-1920s, even Lenin and Trotsky ask an American consultant to develop the national industries of the Soviet Union. But that's just the beginning. After the Second World War, consultants start carving out more space in the public sector, at one organization in particular, the US Space Agency, NASA.
People were going to go to the moon. And the question was, did you want to hire an enormous number of people to work in the American federal government when this was politically unpalatable? Or did you want to find some sort of structure? Literally, how are we going to do that? How is the state going to do that?
3 years after it was founded, 85% of NASA's $1 billion budget went to outside contractors. One of the main recipients, McKinsey. Hiring consultants became attractive to governments for 2 main reasons. Firstly, they have expertise. Stephen van de Walle looks into how the public sector can be reformed.
We can actually work with people who do this all the time, rather than having civil servants who will work on such projects just once or twice in a lifetime.
And secondly, they are flexible.
I need someone here and now. Where can I find it? I cannot hire someone in the public sector. This takes way too long.
In the 1980s, consulting found a new fuel. Some governments began slashing what they believed were bloated ranks of civil servants, aiming to make the public sector more businesslike. Here's former US President Ronald Reagan talking about it.
Outside of its legitimate functions, government does nothing as well or as economically as the private sector of the economy.
Reagan in the US and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the UK outsourced more and more government work to consultancies. In 1979, the UK government was spending around £6 million on consulting. 11 years later, that amount was more than 40 times larger.
There has been this, again, since the 1980s, a kind of growth in the assumption or an emergence and entrenchment of the assumption that civil servants are, not necessarily the most innovative people. They are paper pushers. And then, that idea is then contrasted with the idea of the management consultant who represents the kind of private sector ingenuity and innovative potential.
The dissolution of the Soviet Union in the 90s opened a whole new market for consultancies. And as the International Monetary Fund and World Bank spread neoliberal policies across the globe, so did public sector consulting. So, to summarize, behind the consulting boom is this idea.
Government should not do things, but should steer things. Government sets the policy, others implement and execute the policy.
We don't do policy, we do execution is also a line that consultancies stress. In 2017, McKinsey was doing just that for the US Immigration Office, ICE. Then US President at the time, Donald Trump, passed a string of executive orders. They significantly increased the number of immigrants eligible for deportation. Garrison Lovely was an analyst on the project.
And the McKinsey project fully got behind this, and all hands were on deck to figure out how to comply with the executive orders.
McKinsey's mission? Hiring more ICE officers, speeding up deportations, and cutting costs. Their recommendations included cuts in spending on food for detained migrants.
Some staff on the ICE side of things were actually concerned about the severity of the recommendations coming from McKinsey, because McKinsey looks at things in spreadsheets, and it's optimizing and turning knobs and widgets and everything to make some process cheaper, faster, whatever the metric is to optimize for. And when the metric is deporting more people faster or more cheaply, you can imagine how that has really negative repercussions.
McKinsey stopped consulting ICE in 2018. Some of its recommendations were never implemented, but the case still opens a question.
When you're working for immigration and customs enforcement and the administration changes to the Trump administration, and then you go full in on helping the Trump administration implement its very harsh, immigration policies, how can that not be political?
Some also worry that letting profit-driven companies execute government policies can mean a clash of values.
McKinsey makes the public sector more like the private sector.
There is a clear potential there for a clash of values, but I'm not convinced that the public sector itself wouldn't be able to take those decisions itself. So governments also have a pretty bad record in making public value-driven decisions.
McKinsey declined to provide a comment for this video. And there's another issue that's being flagged. Consultancies don't just make deals with democracies. McKinsey has consulted Ukrainian oligarchs, Kremlin-linked Russian companies, and the South African government under former President Jacob Zuma. One of McKinsey's and BCG's largest clients, Saudi Arabia. In 2023, the kingdom spent nearly €2 billion on consulting services. Compared to the rest of the world, the tasks McKinsey & Co. take on in the kingdom reach much deeper into governing territory, including advising the kingdom's sovereign wealth fund worth more than $900 billion and helping to construct a megacity in the desert. Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Economy and Planning has even been dubbed the Ministry of McKinsey.
So the theory for McKinsey working in Saudi Arabia, or at least the kind of justification that will be given, is something like, oh, we'll be a liberalizing force. We'll help them like open up, and help empower women and modernize the economy and do all these things.
But there's evidence that their work goes further. In 2016, McKinsey prepared a report for the Saudi government to investigate the popularity of their policies. It included a PowerPoint slide identifying 3 people who had been critical of the regime.
One of those people was arrested, another person, the account disappeared, and another person, his brothers were arrested. So there's, bad things happened after McKinsey made this slide deck.
McKinsey defended itself by stating the slide was prepared for internal use only. And this is not the only time they've come under fire.
If you have like Saudi Arabia as a client, you have to be deferential to Saudi Arabia to some extent to continue working there.
In 2018, Saudi American journalist Jamal Khashoggi was assassinated by agents of the Saudi government. The killing put a strain on traditionally strong U.S. ties with the kingdom. In the aftermath, many U.S. firms boycotted an investment summit in the country. But McKinsey and BCG stayed on and even led panel discussions at the event, according to the New York Times. Both firms have stated they decline work in the country linked to military and defense. But still, critics say what McKinsey is doing in Saudi Arabia isn't in line with the image it projects. Like their code of conduct, which says we have the duty to speak up and to never engage in harassment or discrimination.
McKinsey itself likes to think of itself as a moral company with values. It's got all these values, and it takes them very seriously.
Rosie also pointed out possible conflicts in consulting governments across the democratic spectrum.
In countries that are less democratic or which have authoritarian governments, then certainly consultancy companies might be wielded or in theory could be wielded in ways that further obfuscate the power and decisions of those making these decisions.
Earlier this year, the US Congress questioned BCG and McKinsey for failing to declare details about their work for the kingdom. And this isn't the only time consultancies have advised both sides of the geopolitical table. At the beginning of this year, McKinsey CEO Bob Sternfeld was questioned about its work for Chinese companies.
Let's talk about some of your clients. Like the China Communications Construction Company. This is a firm that is blacklisted by the United States government. This is a state-owned enterprise that is responsible for building artificial islands in the South China Sea, probably in direct contravention of international law, certainly in direct contravention to United States security interests. You help them develop their 5-year plan. My question is, why should you be able to get any contracts in the United States government? If you're going to advise foreign nations who are hostile to us and make gobs of money off of them, why should you be getting U.S. government contracts?
Senator, we've never worked with the Chinese Communist Party or the central government in China, to the best of my knowledge.
You're working with state-owned enterprises. China's not a democracy.
McKinsey's work in Saudi Arabia and China shows a concerning side of government consulting. They're a profit-driven company advising governments and their rivals. And until now, they've gone largely unchecked.
McKinsey works with most of the biggest companies in the world, works with governments around the world, works with nonprofits around the world. We can't buy the idea that McKinsey is just a profit-seeking company and is amoral.
One of the justifications for hiring consultants is the expertise and innovation they bring to governments. That was also the idea behind rebuilding Sweden's largest hospital in 2008, the Nya Karolinska Solna, or Karolinska University Hospital.
The new Karolinska Solna was designed or was envisioned as a hospital that would embody all of these things, that would create savings eventually for the public sector and enable better forms of care for Sweden's aging population, for the wider population. It was supposed to be a world-leading medical center.
To achieve those grand ambitions, the Swedish government hired BCG, which pushed for a new hospital system, value-based healthcare. It's a healthcare model that prioritizes cost-effectiveness.
Karolinska was also like it was like a showroom for the BCG. It was supposed to be a showroom for value-based healthcare.
Anna Gustafsson spent years reporting on the Karolinska University case.
The problem was that this had never been tested out in big scale. And so Karolinska was like a test bed.
When the hospital reopened, negative headlines flooded Swedish news. The restructuring had plunged the hospital into dysfunctionality. The British Medical Journal described the implementation as chaotic, resulting in an IT breakdown, a shortage of beds, and even a patient death.
There were consultants sitting, inventing new terminology for the different functions in the hospital. How can someone in a different hospital in Stockholm or outside Stockholm get in contact with the right person in Karolinska when they had changed all the terminology into a management kind of lingo?
Anna's investigations for a Swedish newspaper show that the chaos in the new hospital eventually contributed to long waiting lists for critical abdominal surgeries.
In the end of the summer of 2017, it turned out that more than 60 people had their abdominal cancer operations postponed because of this catastrophe, which it was. At least 4 people died before they had their operation.
And there was another major issue: ballooning costs. In 2040, when the entire project is completed, it's estimated to have cost 5 times the original budget. On Wikipedia, the hospital even made it onto the list of most expensive buildings in the world.
And there are many different reasons for this, but one of them has been the huge reliance on management consultancies, really from the outset of the project, in providing analysis for evaluating how financing for the project should look like, for example, right up until involvement of management consultants in the design and development of management systems or forms of management.
Among the costs that spiraled was spending on BCG, which billed the hospital around $25 million despite the negative headlines. The director of the hospital and an operations manager, who was originally a BCG consultant, eventually stepped down. The board was exchanged. The case shows the potential pitfalls of relying on consultancies for change and innovation.
We tend to look to government to fail and business to do right, and strangely, that's not immediately obvious.
When we have that challenge, instead of having as the kind of default, we should turn to these management consultancies to help us innovate. What would it mean instead to look inwards to the capabilities and the knowledge that exists within the healthcare professionals working in the Swedish healthcare system, and use them and harness them really as the kind of driver of innovation within the healthcare system?
BCG declined to give a comment, saying their work falls under confidentiality agreements. Researching the Karolinska case made me wonder, if outsourcing government work to private companies can be problematic, how come it's experienced such a boost? The experts I spoke to say that governments are in a kind of vicious outsourcing cycle.
A reliance or a dependence on consultancies to deliver critical and important tasks by government has the effect of undermining the ability of public sector organizations and services to learn and adapt over time in response to evolving challenges that governments are set up to meet.
The examples we've looked at so far show that no matter which country or sector, McKinsey and BCG seem ubiquitous. It's part of what gives them expertise, not just when dealing with rivaling countries. Take the sustainability business, for example. It's booming, and consultancies have placed themselves at the center of it. In 2021, McKinsey bought 3 sustainability consultancies, and BCG was the official consulting partner of the UN Climate Change Conference. On the one hand, consultancies have left big marks in the sustainability sector. Like the gas cost curve that McKinsey came up with, it helps figure out the most efficient ways to cut greenhouse gases.
And at the same time, they're also providing advice on how to, for example, expand contracts in oil and gas.
McKinsey has advised at least 43 of the world's 100 biggest polluters, according to the New York Times. BCG is also in the business. If consultancies aim to maximize their clients' profits, pushing for decarbonization could be a conflict of interest. A few years ago, McKinsey's work for fossil fuel clients even sparked a rebellion within its own ranks. More than 1,000 of the firm's employees signed an internal letter warning that our inaction on, or perhaps assistance with, client emissions poses serious risk to our reputation. There's another reason that critics are raising their eyebrows at climate consulting.
The kind of growing involvement of consultancies in climate policy and in climate governance may actually, constitute a form of greenwashing that enables governments and politicians, and also, companies in the private sector as well, to present the picture that they are pursuing climate goals, that they are pursuing emissions reductions, when they are not, in fact, doing this.
Like when the Australian government contracted McKinsey to help develop its plan to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Australia is one of the largest exporters of coal and natural gas, and its government at the time didn't place climate protection high up on its agenda.
McKinsey had been contracted to develop a lot of the analysis, and it was subsequently pointed out that actually the strategy or the plan that had been laid out in this report would not enable the government to get to net zero by 2050, and that there were lots of holes in the report. There was a big reliance on the development of technologies that do not, and the rolling out of technologies that do not exist yet.
Rosie also criticizes that the report placed the onus on farmers rather than on mining companies to become more sustainable.
In the case of Australia's net zero strategy, it was not only that the government was, perhaps ideologically or politically less interested in the pursuit of carbon neutrality at the time, but also that it was keen to protect existing sources of growth within the economy.
At the beginning of this report, I asked what role consultancies are playing for governments around the world. The experts I spoke to painted a fragmented picture. What became clear is that management consultancies are everywhere, and they are unchecked. Whether they are advising the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Saudi Arabia, the US Immigration Office, oil and gas, or the UN Climate Conference.
Since they're not actually a profession, they don't actually suffer from malpractice. So in a true profession, you can be disbarred or you can be disqualified. But consulting firms don't have a legal code of ethics that they have to live by.
Their global expertise is part of what makes them so sought after. But advising all parties at the table can also create conflicts of interest.
If you're working for a government ministry, helping that government ministry more efficiently be authoritarian, how is that not political?
Proponents of outsourcing say consultancies make the public sector more efficient. And there are certainly many positive examples, like McKinsey helping to set up education centers for refugees in Lebanon, or BCG working with the World Health Organization to control the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. But the examples in this video also show that what checks out on a spreadsheet doesn't always work when people are involved.
You're just not left with the consequences of the decisions that you're making.
We tend to look to government to fail and business to do right, and strangely, that's not immediately obvious.
It's a trend that could be difficult to reverse.